showing off. Don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight. Better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight. Won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me?
Okay, good evening, everybody. Hello, where the hell are my... Oh, you gotta turn captions on before they actually work. Alright, quickly close my door here. Bear with me. Alright, we're on chapter 13 of 15 and epilogue 4. The problem of slavery in Western culture. Woohoo! We're getting near the end. So, so far the poll, I think it ends today or tomorrow. I can't remember. I'll have to look. Actually, I can look right now. Let's see. Where are we at? It is still a tie between the Occult, A History, and the Time Travel Handbook. So what I may do is just go ahead and do both. The Time Travel Handbook is will be a fairly quick read. I'm thinking a couple, 3 sessions maybe. Lots of pictures and not a huge amount of text. So, yeah, it ends in 4 hours. So, I may just go ahead and do both of those. And then the Occult, A History will be a much longer read. So, yeah, we'll just go with that. Also, while I'm thinking about it, and I put this out on Twitter already, we're coming up on 100 episodes of this occult reading stream. We're on 91 tonight, so should I do something for that one? I don't know what. If we go up, when we do the 100th, should I don't know. If anybody has any suggestions, be sure and let me know in comments or go out on Twitter and hit me up there. I pretty much check Twitter every day. I may not be on there all day. In fact, I am never on there all day. On the weekends, I tend to kind of check it a few times, but I don't just hang out there on there waiting for people to put up messages. So, but I'm there. I am there every day. So if you have a suggestion, I will see it. You can DM me on Twitter. I'm good with that. You can also whisper on Twitch. I'm good with that. I no longer use Instagram, and I only go to Facebook to see what family is doing, so I'm not on there. Anyway, let's get into it, shall we? Jump into this 13th chapter. The Enlightenment as a source of anti-slavery thought, the ambivalence of rationalism. We have often been told that the Enlightenment emancipated the European mind from a slavish subservience to authority, tradition, and superstition. that it marked an age when reason unveiled the truths of nature, vindicated the rights of man, and pointed the way to human perfectibility and happiness. We might well assume that such revolutionary tendencies would lead directly to militant abolitionism. Yet the traditional justifications for slavery had survived the scrutiny of humanists and 17th century rationalists. Famous philosophers had shown that a defense of slavery could be reconciled with belief in an abstract natural law and natural rights. Hobbes and Locke, who established much of the framework for future social thought, also openly sanctioned human bondage. And one must remember that it was in the Age of Enlightenment that the African slave trade and West Indian plantation enjoyed their golden years. No intellectual movement is free from imprints of the past, and the process of secularization, as we have already seen, does not always lead to reform. Anti-slavery writers sometimes complained that even the philosophes who boldly attacked most injustices were curiously blind to Negro slavery. Still more disturbing was the fact that many of the key ideas of the Enlightenment could easily be turned against pleas for the abolition of slavery. If human bondage was, as Voltaire said, quote, as ancient as war and war as human nature, end quote, then the institution might be justified by the doctrine of sufficient reason, or be seen as a part of the natural economy of forces. Gordon Turnbull, who drew heavily on Hume and Montesquieu, and who pictured his abolitionist opponents as religious fanatics, condensed in a single passage the conservative side of the Enlightenment. Quote, Negro slavery appears then to be, as far as reason can judge, one of those indispensable and necessary links in the great chain of causes and events, which cannot and indeed ought not to be broken. Or, in other words, a part of the stupendous, admirable, and perfect whole which, if taken away, would leave a chasm not to be filled up by all the wit or the wisdom of erring and presumptuous man. End quote. The repudiation of original sin did not necessarily lead to a sanguine view of human nature or to an abandonment of the ancient distinction between absolute natural law, under which all men were free and equal, and relative natural law, which justified slavery and other forms of subordination. According to Voltaire, domination would be, quote, a mere chimera, an absurdity which no one would think of, end quote, in an ideal world that supplied an easy and certain subsistence for every man. But unfortunately, quote, the human race constituted as it is cannot subsist unless there is an infinite number of useful individuals possessed of no property at all, end quote. If equality was in one sense quote unquote natural, in the actual world there must always be a class who command and a class who obey. Unlike other animals, said the Marquis de Mirabeau, man projects his greed into the future where it encounters no limits. Quote, Il est avide de tout, end quote. Okay, anyway. It was to be expected that fratricidal conflict should have divided the first two men of equal age and rank, and while it was true that man possessed an instinct for sociability and brotherhood, his cupidity made it necessary that the first laws of society bring a division of goods and hence of power. J. Bellon de Saint Quentin held to a more traditional view of sin, but his picture of man's nature echoed common themes of the Enlightenment. Quote, he has become a slave not only of sin, the devil, and the world, but also of his own mind, of his body, of his senses, and generally of all the objects which surround him. End quote. For this reason, he concluded servitude was not only a necessary modification of absolute natural law, but a useful instrument for promoting the public welfare. When the most rigid social stratification prevailed through all of Europe, one had to be careful about holding that slavery violated the golden rule or the law of nature. Most of the philosophers followed the example of Aquinas and argued that if equality was the first intent of nature, inequality was natural in a secondary sense of being necessary for the order and well-being of society. De, D'Alembert flatly said equality was a delusion. Diderot was not to be sure, but was not so sure, but thought that wow, sorry. Diderot was not so sure, but thought the question could not be safely examined in a monarchy. Yet it was monarchs like Joseph II of Austria who tried to extend to the lowest serfs and the protections of a centralized state, and throughout much of Europe it was the landed nobility who said that the central government had no right to interfere in the relation between lord and peasant, that the peasants would be content were it not for outside agitators, that unless peasants were coerced to work, they would become idle, drunken, and dangerous. During the 18th century, the European nobility did much to popularize arguments that would soon be used in defense of colonial slavery, and their powerful counter-offensive to protect and extend their ancient privileges was justified by appeals to traditional liberties, constitutional rights, and the virtues of self-government. In America, similar appeals from provincial legislatures would be fused with the radical philosophy of natural rights. But precisely because equality in America was not a delusion, and there was no need to associate liberal reform with centralized authority, any localized oppression was peculiarly invulnerable. It was an unfortunate fact that Negro slavery was guarded not only by ancient theories of inequality, but also by the rights of private property and the traditional liberties of colonies and states. Local varieties of subordination might also find positive sanction in a philosophy that emphasized empirical facts, the determining influence of environment, and the utility and interrelationship of established institutions. Although Montesquieu attacked the traditional justifications for slavery, he conceded that the institution would have a rational basis in a despotic state, whose subjects would have nothing to lose by selling themselves into bondage, and if slavery would serve no useful function in Europe, where there were sufficient indocuments for voluntary labor, Montesquieu thought it might be founded on natural reason in tropical countries where the heat made men slothful and unwilling to do heavy work except for the fear of punishment. Insofar as European thought moved from abstract universal principles toward an appreciation of the concrete, the variable, and the useful, it furnished new weapons for the defenders of colonial slavery. From Montesquieu, such apologists learned that there was really no need to reconcile involuntary labor with natural law or the social compact. They pointed out that one could not apply European notions of liberty and justice to Negro bondage without resorting to fanciful metaphysics. It was simply an objective fact that the Negroes purchased in Africa were slaves. No one could possibly know the hidden motives behind each African war and every act of enslavement. As in any commercial transaction, such had to be assumed on faith. In any event, Africa was so despotic that Negroes had nothing to lose by becoming slaves and everything to gain by being shipped to America. Having no understanding of true liberty, they would be content. Somebody just followed me. Thank you, whoever you are. I can't quite read it. It was kind of hidden by the captions box, but thank you for the follow. Having no understanding of true liberty, they would be content so long as proper discipline kept them in their place. As Montesquieu had suggested, coercion was a necessary inducement to labor in tropical climates, but in actual fact there was a nicely tuned balance between the master's self-interest and the slave's aspirations for happiness. Indeed, quote-unquote slavery was a mere word that had misleading connotations. The actuality was a reciprocal relationship between... Oh, I got... hello, what is that? I can't quite read it from here. Romeo. Kanye. What about Kanye? Who is Romeo? My mom tells me stories about how my ancestors were slaves. Well, a lot of people's ancestors were slaves, unfortunately. Of course, if we go back far enough, everybody's ancestors were slaves at one point or another, but I get what you mean. And that's why I'm reading this book, because this guy pulls no punches towards anybody at all, and that's why it won the Pulitzer Prize in '67. So, anyway, back to it. Um, Indeed, slavery was a mere word that had misleading connotations. The actuality was a reciprocal relationship between human beings similar to that between lord and peasant or master and apprentice, except of course that slaves lived in luxurious abundance compared to European peasants and workers. Okay, before I go on, if you want to see or hear the rest of this book, I have been reading it. This is chapter 13. Um, it is I put them on YouTube as I go. I heard masses would yeah, I I'd say that's a pretty stupid take to want to be a slave. I mean, if that's a kink thing, this is not the place for it. This is actually a book about slavery. Anyway, I'm going to get back to the book. Even writers who expressed sympathy for the Negro slave and who agreed that the institution was wrong in the abstract were apt to conclude that a necessary evil is not unmixed with blessings. One could take the hard-boiled approach of Edward Bancroft, quote, "In this state there is no medium. Either the minds of slaves must be depressed by abject slavery, or the lives of their masters are in imminent danger. Many things which are repugnant to humanity may be excused on account of their necessity for self-preservation." End quote. But more common was the plea offered in 1746 by London Magazine, quote, "But allowing more justice in, or at least a great deal of necessity for, making slaves of this sable part of the species, surely I think Christianity, gratitude, or at least good policy is concerned in using them well and in abridging them of several brutal and scandalous customs." End quote. Please be respectful in this chat. Yes, please. What religion is that would say it's good to be a slave? I'm truly curious now. Because I've studied a hell of a lot of religions, and I've never seen one that said it's good to be a slave. I mean, to be a servant of God and stuff like that, yes. Anyway, no answer. That's fine. Let's continue. The attitudes of Edmund Burke are important because they were partly an extension of the ideas of Montesquieu and also represented a turning point in the political philosophy of the Enlightenment. Nothing could have been more repugnant to Burke's thought than militant abolitionism. Anyone who regarded abstract reasoning on natural rights as, quote, the great Serbonian bog, end quote, who worshipped stability and continuity, who looked on existing institutions as the products of purposeful experience and the unconscious wisdom of past generations, and who feared the quote-unquote inconveniences of sudden change far more than the persistence of injustice, could not help but find a certain prescriptive sanction for slavery. Yet the American colonies clearly lacked the large number of, quote, low and middling men of a free condition, and that beautiful graduation from the highest to the lowest, where the transitions all the way are almost imperceptible, end quote, which were necessary conditions for a secure and prosperous society. And as Burke noted as early as 1757, nothing could justify a trade, quote, which must depend for its support upon the annual murder of several thousands of innocent men, but the necessity we are under of peopling our colonies, and the consideration that the slaves we buy were in the same condition in Africa, end quote. Okay, what? Well, thank you, Who is Romeo, for coming in. Um, Hopefully, you're not turned off by this other nonsense. You'll come back. And like I said before, um, go to my channel on YouTube. It's under the same name, Menace Gilgalad. And if you want to start from the beginning of the book, it's all there up to about chapter 11 right now, I think, or maybe 10. So I put them up every couple of days. No real schedule, just kind of every couple of days I upload a few videos. So they're all there, along with every other book that I have read on this stream. So including 1984 and some other pretty interesting stuff. So come on back, please, and check out that YouTube channel as well. Okay. How long is this chapter? While we're already paused, I'm going to see how long the chapter is. We've got quite a ways to go. Whew, long ways to go. There's the end, 14. So we've got about 25 pages to go. Slightly under. Okay, so let's just plow into it here. For a time, Burke looked upon Negro slavery as an empirical fact, as part of the unique institutional structure of the colonies. Its victims suffered more than, quote, any people in their condition in any part of the world in any other period of time, end quote. But Burke realized that Negroes were, quote, stubborn and intractable for the most part, and that they must be ruled with the rod or iron. I would have them ruled but not crushed with it, end quote. Severe oppression was both dangerous and uneconomical. In time of war, the slave colonies were particularly vulnerable to insurrection, and an improvement in the Negro's condition would not only increase security, but lessen costs of production and enlarge the American market for British goods. Such reforms, however, would have to be made slowly and in accordance with what Montesquieu called the esprit général of the colonies, which included climate, laws, manners, and established usages. If some day slavery were to be abolished, it should be done by the Americans themselves. Yet even that was probably not desirable, since, quote, slaves are often much attached to their masters. A general wild offer of liberty would not always be accepted, end quote. As late as 1792, Burke thought, quote, the cause of humanity would be far more benefited by the countenance of the trade and servitude regulated and reformed than by the total destruction of both or either, end quote. Some 12 years earlier, however, he had drafted an elaborate plan to make both the African trade and colonial slavery humane, moral, and antiseptic. Under ideal circumstances, Burke's concern for details of regulation and his views on the flexible use of sovereign power might have fulfilled his new objective of eradicating slavery through gradual amelioration. But as Burke knew, circumstances were never ideal, and eventually time alone would give a presumption of legitimacy to the worst injustices. It would seem, in view of later events, that a power and determination sufficient to carry out Burke's long-range plan could more easily have abolished in a few years what he termed an, quote, incurable evil, end quote, and with probably far less inconvenience for both masters and slaves. Okay, okay, Bobo Romeo, you're about one more message away from being blocked. You're just being a fucking moron. So leave. Um, yeah, quite the discussion is right. This Bo Romeo is acting like a moron, saying how lovely it would be to be a slave. And who is Romeo came in and left. Yeah, you might like the book, but you're just being a troll. So just fucking go. All right. Yet it would be misleading to conclude that the attitudes expressed by Burke were confined to a small group of conservatives. The ideal of dia, the I no, I was right the first time. The ideal of social equilibrium, the belief in the interrelationship and slow evolution of institutions, and the assumption that practical ethics were governed by utility and environment, were all part of the 18th century climate of opinion. They were worked into justifications for American slavery, but also permeated the thought of reformers. Even the radical Amis de Noir, Friends of New, something like that, feared immediate emancipation and, wow, I totally lost it. Even the radical Amis de Noir feared immediate emancipation and searched for a scheme that would slowly transform the slave into a free laborer. Had not the great Montesquieu warned against sudden or large-scale emancipations, recalling that when Vulsinian slaves had won both liberty and political power, they had voted themselves the right to sleep with the brides of freeborn men. The most enlightened of men agreed that benevolence and moral sensibility were all very well, but could not be allowed to bring sudden changes that might break the delicate adjustment of natural and historical forces. Humanitarian zeal must be balanced by a respect for solid facts and for the testimony of calm and sensible men. Above all, one must preserve a sense of proportion and an expedient regard for the public interest. There were many forms of evil and oppression in even the most advanced nations. It would be sheer hypocrisy to blame one class of property holders for the excesses of a few individuals or for desiring the valid goals of profit and public security. Perhaps the enlightened mind's most typical response to the problem of slavery was to devise a plan like Burke's for the inspection and regulation of all phases of the system, from the African market to the daily life of the plantation. or to inaugurate administrative reforms in the manner of Marquis de Pombal of Portugal and Charles III of Spain. Even the more dedicated abolitionists assumed that they could work toward their goal indirectly and without infringing on legitimate rights and interests. A single act, such as outlawing the slave trade, would set in motion a chain of forces that would lead irresistibly to freedom. There was, however, a far more explosive side to the ideas and tendencies of the Enlightenment. In 1748, a Jamaican physician named James Smith decided to experiment with the popular 18th century device of satire. A believer in down-to-earth practicality and good sense, he was much disturbed by a proposed bill which would have allowed free Negroes and mulattoes to give evidence in court against members of their own class. To dramatize the danger of such an injudicious move, he wrote a petition that purported to come from Cudjoe, that's in quotes, Cudjoe, and to represent the sentiments of 160,000 slaves, quote, unjustly and inhumanely detained in thraldom and bondage in the island of Jamaica, end quote. Thinking that the new law would give them the right to testify in all cases, the slaves looked forward to the vindication of, quote, our natural rights as men, end quote. Soon they would imprison their quote-unquote Egyptian taskmasters, exterminate the Jews, and take possession of the Promised Land. James Smith may have thought it witty sport with such ideas as a means of deflating do-goodery, but for the Jamaican Assembly it was no laughing matter. After solemnly resolving that the petition was a false, scandalous, seditious libel, which could only excite mutiny and insurrection, they asked the governor to persecute the good doctor without delay. For all its respect for utility, moderation, and rational order, the Enlightenment was a challenge to traditional authority. Like the Protestant Reformation, it was based on a conviction that history had somehow polluted the sources of truth and virtue. But where the Protestant reformers had searched for authentic standards in the revealed Word of God, the men of the Enlightenment looked to an uncorrupted human nature. The transition was epitomized in an argument in Gentleman's Magazine in 1735 because, quote, reason and virtue are natural to the mind of man, end quote. The true explanation, quote, of our ancient bigotry and our ancestors being slaves to principle or faith was because they were slaves by law and power, end quote. We have already said that 17th century British Protestantism announced many of the themes of the secular Enlightenment. In France, where the new philosophy had to fight for survival against an abolitionist church and state, its doctrines became at once more anti-clerical and revolutionary. After the Glorious Revolution and the rise of latitudinarian religion, Englishmen had less need of picturing God as an arbitrary tyrant whose authority and very existence must be denied. Their respect for historic liberties made them fundamentally unsympathetic to Voltaire's pronouncement that, quote, past times are as if they had never been. It is always necessary to start at the point at which one already stands, and at which nations have arrived, end quote. Nevertheless, the philosophies bore a heavy debt to British deism and to the rational theology of men like Locke and Samuel Clarke. If their thought continued to carry the imprint of Cartesian rationalism, they were inspired by British books, and they looked to England for examples of tolerance. Public enlightenment and free institutions. Oh, that was the end of the sentence, sorry. It was Voltaire who inaugurated the convention of using British and American Quakers as models of a simple and heartwarming virtue that stood in sharp contrast to the inhumanity of Orthodox Christians. And there were ideas shared by philosophies and liberal British Protestants which directly challenged the traditional Christian view of slavery. God was a benevolent and constitutional ruler who desired the happiness of his subjects. He would not think of sanctioning perpetual and unmerited punishment of any kind. Because men possessed a natural capacity for virtue, their mistakes arose from superficial troubles and could be better controlled by education and psychological adjustment than by coercive discipline. There was no sharp dualism between the material and spiritual realms. True freedom and harmony were not to be found in resignation and faith, but in gradual illumination of the mind, in eradication of error and superstition, and in leading a useful life. The test of a religion or philosophy was its tendency to promote virtue and happiness. If the patriarchs of the Old Testament possessed slaves, that was simply another crime to be added to their acts of incest, treachery, adultery, and murder. Although Montesquieu believed that the spirit of Christianity had eliminated bondage in Europe, Voltaire accumulated evidence to show that the Church had always accepted slavery, which was further proof of its contempt for human nature. Ironically, pro-slavery writers like St. Quentin presented similar evidence to establish the legitimacy of perpetual servitude. Since most British and American abolitionists would be devout Christians, they would meet this problem by resorting to the doctrine of moral progress or by devising elaborate anti-slavery interpretations of Scripture and early church history. But Voltaire prepared the way for more secular critics who would dismiss religious sanctions as irrelevant. And above all, he stood for a questioning frame of mind which could say, with respect to a war captive's right to escape, quote, "Nature decides against Grotius," end quote. I don't know who Grotius is. If anybody does know, let me know. I am not familiar with that name. It was, however, if it's out of the Bible or something, I wouldn't know because I have not read the whole thing. It was, however, the more conservative Montesquieu who did the most to undermine the pro-slavery authority of Aristotle, the Justinian Code, and the 17th century philosophers. This was not because he developed a clear and forthright position against slavery. Montesquieu's profound respect for institutions, for stability and balance, for the established order of society, and for the concrete varieties of human laws and customs made his political philosophy less conducive to abolitionism than was that of Locke, whose social compact was too abstract and inflexible to allow for slavery. As we have seen, Montesquieu's emphasis on environmental differences played into the hands of pro-slavery apologists. His suggested legislative reforms fell short of the more enlightened slave codes, to say nothing of Burke's sweeping plan. Since his sharpest critical remarks were in the dangerous form of satire, they were easily misinterpreted. Even in an age of sparkling wit, there was risk in saying that Negroes had such black skins and squashed noses that it was almost impossible to pity them, or that it was hardly to be believed that God, in his infinite wisdom, should place a soul, and it's a bunch of French that I'm not going to bother butchering. To be sure, Montesquieu made his purpose more obvious by adding that Egyptians, who were the best philosophers in the world, killed all red-haired men who fell into their hands. He pointed to the Negro's preference for glass necklaces over ones of gold, as certain proof of intellectual inferiority. He concluded that, quote, "It is impossible for us to suppose that these beings should be men, because if we supposed them to be men, one would begin to believe that we ourselves were not Christians," end quote. But these passages were later used to support the doctrine of Negro inferiority, and even in 1900, the editor of an English translation of L'Esprit de Loi um, my best version of that French, could solemnly say, quote, the above arguments form a striking instance of the prejudice under which even a liberal mind can labor, end quote. The key to Montesquieu's remarkable influence on anti-slavery thought lies in the fact that he was the first important philosopher to subject the problem to the critical tools of the Enlightenment. And in an age of emergent literacy, when knowledge of the most fashionable writers was an indispensable mark of status, the opinions of so great a figure were bound to be reprinted in magazines, quoted by statesmen and philosophers, and embodied in the works of men like William Blackstone. If the Enlightenment impeached all the old authorities, it provided new ones in their place. Pause. The intellectual context and background of Montesquieu's views on slavery have been meticulously analyzed by Russell P. Jameson, and therefore require only the briefest summary. By the mid-1730s, when Montesquieu decided to write L'Esprit de Loi, a growing interest in Africa and the West Indies had been excited by the travel accounts of men like William Bosman, Pierre Labat, and Pierre Charlevoix, and the Academy of Bordeaux, of which Montesquieu was a member, was sponsoring an inquiry into the reasons for the Negro's physical characteristics. As president of the Parliament of Bordeaux, Montesquieu not only spent much of his time in the slave trading port, but was a close friend of Jean Mellon, the economist who defended slavery in 1734 on principles of utility and public welfare. Montesquieu was an extraordinarily erudite jurist and scholar. He was well aware of the anti-slavery arguments of Baudin and of the embarrassing questions which Germain Formigot had raised in the 1690s concerning legitimacy of title. He probably knew that a few Protestants, such as Jacques Bernard and Johann Budius, had held that slavery was repugnant to the spirit of Christian love, and that consent was a prerequisite to legitimate servitude. Given this background, one might have expected Montesquieu to consider the relations of Negro bondage to the precepts of divine and natural law, to the rules of war, to the principles of labor, commerce, and national wealth. One might have looked for speculations on the meaning of racial differences and for a detailed discussion of the modes of enslavement in Africa, the character of the slave trade, and the management of Negroes under American law and custom. But none of this is to be found in L'Esprit de Loi. Montesquieu did not include slavery in his chapters on war, government, liberty, or commerce. He turned to the subject immediately after his famous book 14 on the influence of climate on mankind. And Book 15 was not really addressed to slavery as such, but to the ways in which the laws of civil slavery relate to quote unquote the nature of the climate. The odd thing is that Book 15 has little to say about climate, but rather considers slavery at once in terms of universal principles and of specific consequences in different societies, and this is what gives the analysis its subtle importance. Future anti-slavery movements would be absolutely dependent upon the ancient doctrine of an immutable higher power, higher law, which authority would nullify the prescriptive sanction of a local institution. But historically, this higher law had tended to be so transcendent that it had little bearing on existing institutions, or, as jus gentium, it was identified with the immemorial experience of mankind, and hence gave support to certain forms of human bondage. The abolition of slavery would also require a theory of law as the positive will of the sovereign, whose commands would be guided by a sense of social utility and public welfare. But without the standard of a higher and universal law, a sovereign might agree with Hobbes or Mellon that slavery served the best interests of the state. Montesquieu had the genius to find a compromise that was not unlike the Church's synthesis of spiritual power and objective institutions. There was, he insisted, an eternal, uniform, and rational system of law which limited even the will of God. But this higher law was not a set of abstract rules. It consisted of certain inherent and necessary relationships which could be understood only in concrete situations. In other words, to grasp the underlying principles of a form of government, one had to study specific governments. Natural law as a norm for future action was to be derived from an empirical examination of social relationships. The wise sovereign would try above all to preserve the integrity of the general principle which gave form to this particular society. Fully cognizant of the limiting forces of climate, soil, and geography, he would still be an instrument of moral influence, and so far as possible would shape and adjust institutions in conformity with natural law. We have already seen how Francis Hutcheson, who was writing at about the same time as Montesquieu, worked from the subjective moral sense to the principle of social utility. Montesquieu, in effect, worked from social utility toward general laws which would guide the enlightened sovereign. When brought together, these two approaches would provide a theoretical basis for effective anti-slavery action. The private moral judgment of individuals would use a quote-unquote useful outlet in the demonstration that slavery was contrary to the public good and hence to natural law, and the sovereign power, with an eye on both expediency and principle, would take positive action to eliminate the evil. Unfortunately, Montesquieu's attempt to apply his method to slavery was curiously uncertain and disjointed. In Les Lettres Persanes, again, more French, his approach had been purely utilitarian and relativistic. Uzbek, one of the Persian travelers, takes a skeptical view of all American colonization and regards the slave trade as an extravagant waste of men which has brought no benefit to Europe, Africa, or America. In Persia, slaves are mostly used for the protection of harems, and thus the state is deprived of potential fathers and workers. But Uzbek notes that it was otherwise in ancient Rome, where slaves contributed to the wealth, population, and general good of the republic. Yet in his Pensées, Montesquieu refuted the justifications for slavery in Roman law, asserted that, more something about men, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. It's another big thing in French. I'm not going to bother butchering. And eloquently concluded in more French stuff I'm not going to bother with. His task then in L'Esprit de Loi was to reconcile this view of natural law with his profound respect for the differing needs of various forms of government and society, and he confessed that he was unsure whether his pen had been guided by his heart or his understanding. When it came to the question of man selling himself into slavery, Montesquieu fell back upon an abstract syllogism. A sale presupposed a price. By definition, slavery meant that one man had absolute dominion over the life and fortune of another. Therefore, the slave could receive nothing, and the sale was void. But positively, liberty was a priceless blessing to its successor. But then Montesquieu came down from the lofty realm of formal logic and extracted a normative rule from a description of the actual behavior of men. All nations rejected the idea of killing prisoners of war in cold blood, and since there was no necessity of killing an enemy if it was possible to capture him, there could be no ground for arguing that slavery was a necessary means of saving life. In any event, it was not compassion to substitute one humane act for another, inhumane act, for another, even if it meant a lessening of cruelty. On a still more specific level, Montesquieu tried to show that slavery violated the underlying principles of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And if this demonstration was not particularly convincing, it gave a more universal cast to important themes which the philosopher had touched upon in Les Lettres Persanes. Slavery retarded the growth of population, debased one class to the detriment of public virtue, and corrupted another with luxury and excessive power. Finally, the institution was to be gauged by examining its tangible effects as a reciprocal relation between two men. According to Montesquieu, even the murderer benefited from the law that condemned him to death, since his life had always been protected by it. But no such utility, however dubious, could be found in slavery. The institution prevented the slave from acting virtuously and imparted to the master a cruel and choleric spirit. Empirical evidence then confirmed the deductions of logic. Utility coincided with natural law. There were, of course, those disturbing questions about despotic states and debilitating climates. But Montesquieu had done much to discredit the classical justifications for slavery, and he had struck off any number of quotable epigrams, such as La liberté de something about liberté publique. And it was this sense of the public good as distinct from any private or partial interest which was perhaps his most significant contribution to anti-slavery thought. The slave, by the very nature of his condition, was beyond the reach of civil law and hence of civic obligation. His subordination, unlike that of a subject to his sovereign, could not serve the general good. The partiality of the defenders of slavery could be exposed, Montesquieu said, by watching their reaction to a plan for a national lottery that would make 9/10 of the population the absolute slaves of the remaining tenth. This would prove, he wrote to Grossley, that a whole bunch more French that I can't read. Sorry. Something about men. It's the only word I know out of it. These conclusions set the tone for much of the Enlightenment's response to Negro slavery. Montesquieu showed, first of all, that the subject involved momentous issues which invited rational analysis and debate. In an age when universities and scientific academies promoted essay and debating contests on the most controversial topics, it was only natural that the legality of slavery should preoccupy the students at Edinburgh in 1764, at the College of Philadelphia in 1768, and at Harvard in 1773. The following year, even a Jamaican debating society considered whether the slave trade was consistent with morality, sound policy, and the laws of nature, and the negative side won. It was such an essay contest at Cambridge University that first aroused the zeal of Thomas Clarkson. Montesquieu also popularized assumptions and methods that might be highly useful for later anti-slavery writers. Through an analysis of concrete facts, one could reconstruct the general principle which governed the growth and social consequences of a particular institution. Such analysis and synthesis prove that underlying superficial differences in government and religion, men revealed the same basic needs and weaknesses, a desire for the same pleasures and aversion for the same pains. But the dramatization of this point required imaginative devices that would expose self-centered prejudice and for a startling moment thrust the complacent European into another man's role. This was the motive behind Montesquieu's Les Lettres Persanes, his proposed lottery, and his satirical treatment of radical prejudice. The discovery of a new level of objectivity and self-scrutiny was the goal of much 18th century writing. In 1725, Pierre Marivaux wrote a popular one-act comedy, uh, L'Île des Enclaves, Esclave, anyway, in which two Athenian aristocrats were forced to exchange roles with their slaves for 3 years and are accordingly cured of prejudice and inhumanity. If Negroes, said a writer in the weekly Miscellany, were to seize men on the coast of England, one could imagine the screams of unjust that would arise. Voltaire enlarged upon the notion and pictured an outraged European captain whose ship and crew had been captured by Negroes. What right, the captain asks, have the Negroes to violate the law of nations and enslave innocent men? The Negro chieftain, who presumably has been reading L'Esprit de Loi, explains, quote, "Your nose is long and ours is flat. Your hair is straight and our wool is curled. You are white and we are black. Consequently, we ought, according to the sacred and unalterable laws of nature, to be ever enemies." End quote. And after being reminded of the treatment of Negroes on the Guinea coast, the Europeans, quote, "had nothing to say against so wise a discourse." End quote. In 1766, the physiocratic journal Ephémérides de Citoyen, I don't know, asked its readers to imagine what would have happened if African slave dealers had landed in France during the days of feudal anarchy. Would the tyrants and sanguinary judges who had been responsible for so much evil have refrained from selling their countrymen as slaves? Even now, who could say there would be no price high enough to tempt Frenchmen to sell their neighbors or even their relatives? Such a reversal of roles exposed the hypocrisy of a double standard and the pretense of saying that some men were happiest in a state of slavery. Quote, "What in a European," said a letter writer of 1745, "would be called a glorious struggling for liberty, we call in them rebellion, treachery." End quote. For a freedom-loving people such as the English, it was quote-unquote doubly criminal to sacrifice human beings to the idol of avarice. One day even the roles of nations might be reversed, since the progressing revolution in science and the arts might enable Africa or America to seek revenge upon Europe. By the 1760s, the inconsistency had become a favorite target of those who would prove their own intellectual emancipation from the ethnocentrism of European culture. In the disgusted words of Diderot, "Nous l'avons, blah, 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 blah." More French. Um, Marivaux's comedy of 1725 did not question the right of men to hold slaves. In the end, Arlequin and Cleanthus, the slaves who become masters, voluntarily relinquish power to their true owners. But a half-century later, in Marmontel's melodramatic Les Incas, Las Casas speaks the following words: "Mon frère," something, blah, 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 more French. So, the difference illustrates a major. I wish he had translated that stuff, but, you know, maybe back in 67 it was still a sign of the intellectual to be able to at least read multiple languages. Nowadays, we're all lazy and we don't learn them. So, is that an attack on him or an attack on me? The difference illustrates a major passage of intellectual history, the central theme of which is the dignity and happiness of the individual man. One of the sources of this heightened concern for individual happiness was the cult of moral sensibility which emerged from British Protestantism in the late 17th century. While the tender passions were first celebrated as a defense against materialism and skepticism, they soon became the common property of philosophers who sought to improve the world and to vindicate human nature from the stigma of original sin. In 1725, the year of Ile des Esclaves, the Abbé de Saint Pierre coined the word bienfaisance to describe man's disinterested impulse to promote the happiness of his fellow creatures. On the eve of the French Revolution, Benjamin Froissart could say that bienfaisance was the spirit of the age, which it had sanctified that it had sanctified wealth by providing a channel for aiding the unfortunate, and that it must now redress the crime of past generations who had enslaved the innocent Africans. And as he hid from Robespierre's police, a victim of the Reign of Terror, the Marquis de Condorcet gave perhaps the most eloquent definition to the humanitarian ideal. And this one's actually in English. Wow. The feelings of humanity, that is, a feeling of tender, active compassion for all the evils afflicting mankind, of horror for everything arising either from public institutions or from governmental decrees, or from individual acts, which added new torments to nature's inherent ills. End quote. The Age of Reason was also an age of compassion for afflicted humanity. Diderot, or Diderot, who had written a French translation of Shaftesbury, could weep over the relative minor sufferings of Pamela and Clarissa. Candide shed tears as he entered Suriname, for he had just conversed with a young Negro who, in accordance with the custom of the country, had had an arm and leg cut off, and who had shattered Candide's philosophic optimism by saying that this was the price for the sugar Europeans enjoyed. The hero of La Nouvelle Heloise had a I don't know, had a similar encounter with slaves. In 18th century literature, a feeling of shock and indignation at the physical cruelties of Negro slavery increasingly became a test of sensibility, such as the cruelties themselves became a symbol of man's inhumanity to man. I think I've got about 8 pages left. Nope. 9 pages. 9 pages left. All right. Pause, sip of wine. But an even more significant source of the new interest in individual happiness was the Lockean belief that society is composed of discrete, self-governing individuals. Whose true humanity lies in their proprietorship of their own persons. The disciples of Locke found moral freedom not in self-denial and transcendence of worldly condition, but in a lack of dependence upon the will of others, in the natural exercise of the human faculties, and in the unfettered pursuit of enlightened self-interest. Instead of assuming that this kind of freedom would lead to total anarchy, they held that nature and society could be made compatible only if individuals retained a certain inviolable core of autonomy and self-direction. These ideas, which did so much to shape subsequent political and economic thought, were obviously of the highest importance in discrediting the traditional view of slavery. For in the Lockean philosophy, a slave, so long as he is deemed to be human, must either be classed as a criminal who is beyond the pale of the social contract, or be considered a free man who has been forcefully and unnaturally suppressed. In England, the doctrine of a higher law that supports the rights of individuals lived on through the 18th century. Despite a growing respect for utility, the authority of statute law, and the omnipotence of Parliament, it sometimes found sanction in courts that was championed by a few theorists like Granville Sharp. As early as the 1730s, an occasional essay or letter to a periodical made the momentous observation that, because all men were born free and equal, Negro slavery was a violation of the natural rights of man. This essentially Lockean argument appeared infrequently, but it was endorsed by no less a conservative than Samuel Johnson, who said that the Negro slave was, quote, certainly subject by no law but that of violence to his present master, end quote, and who was reported to have given a toast at Oxford to the next insurrection in the West Indies. But if Lockean ideas could be turned against the institution of slavery, they also supported private property and hereditary inequality. And as Rousseau shrewdly observed, Puffendorf had argued that a man might alienate his liberty just as he transferred his property by contract. And Grotius had said that since individuals could alienate their liberty by becoming slaves, a whole people could do the same and become the subjects of a king. Here, then, was the fatal flaw in the traditional theories of natural rights. Nature could not create masters or slaves, princes or subjects, the rich or the poor. Therefore, asked the socialist, Bono de Mably, quote, how can laws decreed by the body politic and meant to be but the extension of natural laws establish with impunity such a shocking and cruel difference between men, end quote. Rousseau was interested in larger issues than Negro slavery, but because slavery had conventionally been linked with justifications for the existing social order, he saw that an attack on the principle of involuntary servitude might unravel the network of sanctions for every species of injustice. Hence he repeated Montesquieu's arguments on the invalidity of any contract for self-sale, and on the discrepancy between the lawful objectives of war and the enslavement of captives. But Rousseau went on to a far more radical set of conclusions. Men were born free and equal. The renunciation of liberty meant the renunciation of being a man. Since slavery always rested on brute force, which was but thinly disguised by meaningless conventions, bondsmen had no duties or obligations to their masters. The words slave and right were contradictory and mutually exclusive. Even the Lockean notion of continuing private war between slave and master was without foundation, for in the true state of nature, where there was no private property to defend, there could be no war or dominion, and once within the social compact, all men were subject to its laws. The master, then, could appeal to no principle or right to justify his power, and in Rousseau's eyes the same was true of all the authorities and powers in Europe. For the loss of natural equality necessarily brought the loss of liberty, and because the development of agriculture and technology had led to widening inequalities, the great mass of mankind had become enslaved by either force or fraud. All Rousseau's arguments against empty conventions, prescriptive rights, and the alienation of liberty were as applicable to society in general as to the most tyrannical forms of servitude. Except for such radical sectarians as the Ranters and Toberites, no one had condemned the principle of slavery so uncompromisingly. But Rousseau's very extremism led to certain paradoxes. He regarded the subordination of one individual to another as an act of dehumanization to which only a madman could consent. Like the orthodox idea of sin, slavery was so vile and corrupting a state that its victims lost even their natural love for liberty. Men born into slavery were as content with their condition as were the swine who had once been the companions of Ulysses. Rousseau assures us that Aristotle mistook effects for causes when he concluded that some men must be born to be slaves, but his distinction would seem academic to many future apologists for the institution who could ask quite plausibly why the condition of happy and contented men should be changed. Baron de Holbach brought out the more disturbing implications of the environmentalist argument when he claimed that it was possible for entire nations to be beaten down by fear, superstition, and habits of thought until they became indifferent to the charms of liberty. Huh. If this were so, why should the detention of such men be more tyrannical than the detention of men who were slaves by nature? Of course, a man whose personality had been shaped for slavery by the environment would be potentially capable of being molded back into a free man. But if one agreed with John Miller that bondage often made a man, quote, worthy of that contempt with which he is treated, end quote, it would appear that whatever the origins of slavery, the obstacles to emancipation remained very great. Emancipation involved another paradox. In a Lockean view, it would simply mean a severing of artificial bonds and a restoration of natural liberties. Condorcet, though fully aware of the corrupting effects of bondage, put his faith in the restorative power of nature. Quote, give them their freedom, and because they are closer to nature, they will be better men than you, end quote. But because Rousseau addressed himself to the emancipation of all mankind, and because he had no faith in either gradual progress or a return to the state of nature, he was convinced that true freedom could be achieved only through the subjection to the general will. Whether one regards this theory as democratic or totalitarian, it is clear he had revived the ancient idea that the only genuine liberation lies in a higher form of servitude. Rousseau's citizen would find his identity in the general will, such as Aristotle's slave found his identity in his master. The final paradox is that Rousseau, by associating slavery with all forms of authority and subordination, reinforced the traditional claim of pro-slavery theorists. In effect, he may have made conservatives more convinced that an attack on even a remote and somewhat distasteful institution would be a more dangerous thing. In 1755, the year of Rousseau's Discours sur l'inégalité, the death of Montesquieu evoked an introductory eulogy in Volume 5 of the Encyclopedia. The great jurist was specifically credited with having exposed the illegality of human bondage, and in a long article on esclavage, which I'm assuming means slave, which fell within the alphabetical range of the same volume, the Chevalier de Jaucourt developed and strengthened Montesquieu's anti-slavery arguments. Next to L'Esprit de Loi, the Encyclopédie was without doubt the most important agent in making anti-slavery a part of the Enlightenment's overriding concern for the happiness and well-being of mankind. It was not until 1765, however, when the editors arrived at Traite de Nègre, that de Jaucourt was able to rise above the qualifications engendered by Montesquieu's tolerance for institutional differences. The encyclopedist's verdict was now unclouded by historical examples and questions of climate and government. His conclusions carried a note of extraordinary simplicity and directness. Quote, and this is a very long quote, thus there is not a single one of these hapless souls, who we maintain are but slaves, who does not have the right to be declared free, since he has never lost his freedom, since it was impossible for him to lose it, and since neither his ruler nor his father nor anyone else had the right to dispose of his freedom. Consequently, the sale of his person is null and void in and of itself. This Negro does not divest himself, indeed cannot, under any condition, divest himself of his natural rights. He carries them everywhere with him, and he has the right to demand that others allow him to enjoy those rights. Therefore, it is a clear case of inhumanity on the part of the judges in those free countries to which the slave is shipped not to free the slave instantly by legal declaration, since he is their brother, having a soul like theirs. End quote. This passage has seemed worth quoting at some length, since it is one of the earliest and most lucid applications to slavery of the natural rights philosophy, and succeeds in stating a basic principle which was to guide the more radical abolitionists in the 19th century. De Jaucourt was repelled by the idea that local civil law could establish a condition which infringed upon basic human rights, if there were no supreme and eternal law which applied equally to all men, then any kind of banditry might be cloaked with legal forms. De Jaucourt did not say with Rousseau that the entire social order was in fact banditry cloaked with legal forms, but with respect to slavery at least, his version of natural law had something of the uncompromising absolutism of Rousseau's general will. A slave was not really a slave, but a man grievously wronged. His right to escape was as certain as that of a man cornered by highwaymen. Any court refusing to grant a slave his immediate liberty was flouting eternal justice and was, by implication, no longer a valid court. Furthermore, since the sources of natural law were to be found in man's own nature, it excuse me. I lost my place. Furthermore, since the sources of natural law were to be found in man's own nature, in his common physical and spiritual needs, the dictates of such law could never be inconsistent with public utility. If the eradication of colonial slavery brought temporary strains of commercial readjustment, in the long run it could not fail to promote the growth of industry, population, and happiness. In 1765, then, a radical anti-slavery manifesto had been embodied in the great Summa of the French Enlightenment, and beginning in 1770, the subject moved more directly into the foreground with the Abbé Raynal's Histoire du Indies. In this work turned out If this work turned out to be an ill-planned hodgepodge of miscellaneous facts and turgid prose, it was also the chief medium for popularizing the enlightened mind's mixed attitudes toward America. And as such, it was to exert a profound influence on humanitarian thought, especially in Great Britain. There, in 1777, it appeared in translation. We have already discussed Raynal's view of the relevancy of slavery to America's meaning and history, but as the work brought together many of the anti-slavery ideas which had been developing during the half-century since Montesquieu's Les Lettres Persanes, it may also be considered as a culmination of the trends we have just been examining. Like the Encyclopédie, the Histoire de deux Indies was a collaborative enterprise in which Diderot, I think it's Diderot, I've been saying Diderot, Diderot played an important role. Wasn't really thinking it's a French name. The T is probably silent. In 1772, in his it's a big long French name, Diderot attacked the legality of slavery much as de Jaucourt had done, and even defended the right of bondsmen to use any possible means to regain their freedom. But though some of Diderot's writings were apparently spliced into the sections on slavery in the Histoire de deux Indies, the most inflammatory passages were the work of Jean de Pecmeja, a young tutor and future socialist who reported to have said, quote, "I am as pale as death and as sad as life," end quote. Pecmeja's boldest lines were deleted from the third edition. Quote, "Whoever justifies so odious a system deserves scornful silence from the philosopher and a stab with a poniard from the Negro," end quote. But despite such textual changes, there is reason to believe that Raynal, Diderot, and other collaborators shared a militant hatred for Negro slavery, and that the ambivalent attitudes of the Histoire de deux Indies were largely the result of changing stylistic preferences and, one suspects, of underlying tensions in the mind of the Enlightenment. There was, first of all, the sense of living in an age of revelation when all the frauds and errors of the past were being unmasked, and when nothing could be taken for granted, except, of course, man's capacity to know and choose his true good. In words that echoed Rousseau, Renan, and for convenience we shall call him the author, said that what distinguished man from the beasts was not reason, but freedom of will, the power of je veux or je vaux or je ne vaux pas, which even God could not take away. The early Hebrews and Christians had often spoken of themselves as the willing slaves of God, but to Renan this was an absurdity, since man could not be human if he were God's slave. And how could one give a power to another man which was denied even to God? To be sure, religion might inculcate a spirit of subservience, but if there was a religion, Renan wrote, which tolerated the horrors of the African trade, which failed to thunder constantly against the agents of such tyranny, which condemned the slave who broke his chains, and which embraced the judge who sentenced him to death, then its ministers deserved to smother under the debris of their altars. Renan agreed with Voltaire that Christianity had never lightened the burdens of slaves, and in a passage which foreshadowed William Lloyd Garrison's denunciations of the American churches, he declared, quote, "If the Christian faith did thus sanction the greed of empires, it would be necessary to prescribe for all time to, to come its bloodthirsty doctrines," end quote. Nor was prescriptive authority less fallible than religion. The fact that servitude had been accepted through the ages was no proof that it was right. Quote, "If the universality of a practice was proof of its validity, the case for usurpation, for conquest, for all manner of oppression could be made." End quote. Human history, as Rousseau had said, had been a movement from natural freedom and simplicity to a dependence based on force and convention. In most nations, including Europe, the mass of people were in chains, their natural liberty sacrificed to the passions of their oppressors. But where Rousseau became wholly preoccupied with this discovery, Renan was quick to draw distinctions. In an age of light and prosperity, Europe would assuredly progress toward greater liberty, and in fact the condition of the most unfortunate serf was not like that of the Negro slave. It was in America that greed and power and arrogant pride had corrupted an entire class, and it was in America that another class had become so dispirited and degraded in soul that its members almost considered themselves as inferior species. The old world might still suffer from the decaying vestiges of former tyrannies, but in the new world, where there were no limits to either power or subjugation, one might see the specter of what most threatened the progress of mankind. With this recognition of a fundamental difference between the two hemispheres, Renan found that he must descend from the abstract level of universal justice. Like Montesquieu, he saw that character and institutions were shaped by environment. Like Rousseau, he saw that slaves had been so dehumanized that they appeared to have been created for no higher condition. And like Burke, he concluded that if such men were given freedom, they could only lead lives of indolence and crime. Renan's plan for meeting this problem was similar to Burke's, except that it was less legalistic and moved toward liberty more swiftly and through an explicit series of phases. Most of the present generation of slaves could not be freed, but their physical sufferings could be alleviated and their morale improved by music, games, and dances. Emancipation would be a reward for mothers of large families, and would eventually be given to those Negroes who, at the age of 25, had earned the cost of their upbringing and had been well behaved during a 5-year apprenticeship. Renan was more generous than most governments proved to be. He insisted that the public treasury provide each freedman with a cabin and a small plot of land. This was the kind of rational scheme that appealed to the enlightened mind. It required, of course, a strong and enlightened sovereign, and hence Renan addressed his appeal to the kings of Europe. In a poem of 1775, Claude de Sassy, uh, put his hopes in the King of France. Quote, O you, young Louis, whose calm youth promises serene days to the French citizen who reveres you, you must set an example to 100 different peoples. See that our laws are respected in the New World. Their sublime equity has no place for slavery. Break the chains which bind the Negro and Indian. End quote. But young Louis could not have cared less, and Raynal himself was well aware that the sovereigns of Europe might be blinded by self-interest. He seemed suddenly to sense the inconsistency of saying that slaves were the innocent victims of tyranny, and of then relying on kings to inaugurate a plan which would perpetuate the tyranny for at least a generation. To that part of the enlightened mind which prized stability and order, the debased Negro might not seem fit for freedom, but in Raynal's eyes the American slaves were not like Circe's swine. Contented beasts did not revolt, flee to the wilderness, or try to poison their owners. Nature, Raynal concluded, owed her oppressed children a leader, a strong man who would vindicate the honor of the human race, and seek vengeance for 3 centuries of oppression. And if the black heroes followed the law of reprisal, their code blanc would rightfully be a code of terror. This sympathy for outright violence was more than mere sensationalism. It arose from a division in the mind of the Enlightenment, from a tension between the ideal of individual liberty and the quest for a rationally balanced society. It was all very well to speak of bienfaisance as the spirit of the age, and to construct plans for the elimination of human misery. But still, as Raynal said, quote, the slaves are tyrannized, mutilated, burnt, and stabbed, and we receive the news of their torture coldly and with indifference. End quote. Condorcet came to the same bitter thought. Quote, only a few philosophes have from time to time dared raise a cry in favor of humanity, a cry which the establishment has not heeded, and which a superficial society has soon forgotten. End quote. And in the words of de Jacquart, quote, sensitive and generous souls will doubtless second these reasons for which favor humanity, but avarice and greed, which rule the earth, will never heed their plea. End quote. In the last analysis, therefore, the oppressors must either be crushed by a superior force or be persuaded that humanity coincided with their own self-interest. And that, listeners, is the end of the chapter. That one wasn't too bad as far as length. Had an interesting little conversation in chat, some of which I think was misunderstood by me and the other person that was here that left. But not all of it. Some of it was kind of out there. But yeah, anyway. So that was 13. We've got 2 more chapters and an epilogue. I don't know how long the epilogue is or how long the last chapter is. I'll look. I may try to do them, the 15th chapter and the epilogue, in one reading. Depends. If it's super long, I might not be able to. But yeah, that was our 91st. This has been our 91st episode on this reading stream. So I asked earlier, and I'll ask again, should I do anything for the 100th reading stream? We'll be into another book then. I think we'll be reading the Time Travel Handbook, actually. Or thereabouts. We might be just finishing it because it's going to be a short read. But anyway, if you think I should do something, make a suggestion, because I don't know. But anyway, There's 2 hours left on the poll on Twitter if you haven't voted yet. So far, the Occult History has 2 votes. The Time Travel Handbook has 2 votes, and Esoteric Orders has 1 vote. So if no more votes come in to break that tie, I'm just going to do both books. I'm going to do Time Travel Handbook first because it'll be short, and then we'll do the Occult History right after that. So, which I'm fine with. But anyway, that'll be it. I am not rating anybody, and I'm not doing another session tonight. So, I will just see you all in the next one tomorrow night. Damn, bro! I was just ending the session. Sorry. Thank you for popping in, though.